Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at a record highlighting the sacrifices of Nova Scotians during World War I, a piece of early Canadian aviation headgear, and a medal awarded to a Canadian soldier who fought in Ypres. Andrew looks at pieces of uniform insignia and a book listing Nova Scotians who served in the First World War.
Folks at home could learn a lot about their ancestors' military service thanks to the internet and modern technology.
Mark looks at an early leather helmet worn by a fighter pilot.
The flying helmet is a great example. It's in great condition. It shows what the pilots and the observers and crewmen were wearing at that point.
Kevin looks at a star medal bestowed to Private Thomas Fleet.
Some survived, like Thomas, and others, unfortunately, didn't make it back to Canada.
My name is Daniel Thomas O'Brien. I brought in a display of insignia from my grandfather's World War I Army uniform, and also a book about all the members that they were able to list who fought in the war from Nova Scotia.
In 1914, Britain became engulfed in war. Naively coined the war to end all wars by an optimistic but heartbreakingly mistaken H.G. Wells, World War I was a period of unprecedented brutality for all of Europe and beyond. Despite the nature of the beast, young Nova Scotian men and women volunteered to fight alongside their Commonwealth kin in a display of altruism and civic duty perfectly aligned with maritime values. 30,000 of the province's sons and daughters travelled overseas during the Great War, leaving homes empty and families waiting, some for a lifetime. Though time marches on, the memory of their service continues to resonate over a century later in tomes of their exploits, and in heirlooms held dear across generations.
Danny, thanks for coming into Militaria today. You've brought us some interesting artifacts.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So what we have here is bits of insignia off of uniforms, and we have some actually from the First World War, and we have some from the pre-First World War period. The first one I'll discuss is the 66 Princess Louise Fusiliers cap badge, which would indicate that the person in question had prior service prior to the First World War. Now this one right here is a Canada Militia button that would have come off a uniform that was most likely from the uniform from the 66 Princess Louise Fusiliers. And here is a shoulder insignia for the 66 Princess Louise Fusiliers. So this would have been from the pre-World War I period. Over here, we have a shoulder title that was worn during the First World War. Here's a generic cap badge that would have been worn on a visor cap during the First World War. Here we have the Canadian-Scottish shoulder title. Over here we have a button off the 16th Canadian-Scottish uniform. And over here we have a small button that would have been off a shoulder board from a First World War uniform. And over here, this is a souvenir book from the First World War, and it's a listing of names of Nova Scotians that served in the First World War. So this is basically a souvenir book that would have been put out at the end of hostilities, and it would have indicated the names of all those who served. And a lot of families acquired these after the end of the First World War, and it showed, you know, that their loved one had served overseas. Now you said you had a family member that was listed in here?
We have two family members.
I think it was Joseph Lutley, I think was the name that's mentioned, and it mentions your grandfather as well.
Yeah, Joseph Lutley would have been his younger brother.
Now you had mentioned, Danny, that you believe these were from your grandfather, is that correct?
I thought these might have been from both of them.
What was your grandfather's name?
My grandfather's name was Frederick Thomas Lutley.
So I did a quick search just before we started, and I found out that Frederick Thomas Lutley had actually signed up in April of 1918 and served with the 1st Depot Battalion, Nova Scotia Regiment. So I did another little bit of research because you had mentioned that you had your great uncle that had served as well and was actually killed in action during the First World War.
Yes.
Thanks to the wonders of modern technology, and I was able to access their files right off the internet, I found out that this most likely, all this insignia probably belonged to Edward Albert Nagel, who served with the 16th Battalion, Canadian Scottish, during the First World War. And he also had prior service from before the First World War with the 66th Princess Louise Fusiliers. So most likely, all this insignia belongs to Edward Albert Nagel, who is your great uncle. So Danny, what can you tell me about your grandfather? Did you know him personally?
I knew my grandfather very well, yeah.
Did your grandfather mention the war much?
Not to me, no. Talked a little bit with some of the older family members. He saw a lot of horrors. I know it affected his life. Everybody who knew him of the older people noted how much he had changed when he came back. He saw things that a young man shouldn't see, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
And in those years, of course, there was no help for the veterans coming back.
That's correct, yeah.
And there's probably not enough today, but in those days it was not very much at all. So he was very reluctant to say anything about the war.
So Danny, as we discussed earlier, your relative Nagel, who was your grandmother's brother, was killed on September 15th, 1918. He was killed during the battles known as the Last 100 Days, which were a series of battles that were pushing German forces out of France. So he was killed on September 15th, which was, I believe on that day, Canadian forces liberated the town of Courcelette, which was a particularly bad battle. You know, it would have been, tragedy. The war was almost over. And Edward Albert, of course, had seen so much of the war and suffered quite a bit, I imagine, some horrible, horrible battles, and almost made it to the end, but, killed during the last 100 days. Quite a tragedy. Thanks for bringing these interesting artifacts in today, Danny. What are your plans for these artifacts?
Well, they belong to the family. It's part of our family history, so I plan on keeping it that way for the present, for sure. There are some relatives I haven't seen for a long time, and I know they would be pleased to know some of the information that I've learned here from you.
So you're going to keep them in the family?
Keep them in the family, yeah.
Oh, excellent, yeah. Well, thanks for coming in.
Well, thanks very much for having me and for the information I've got. It fills in some of the blanks for me, so
oh, excellent.
It's great.
My pleasure. Folks at home could learn a lot about their ancestors' military service thanks to the internet and modern technology. As we saw earlier, I was able to punch in Edward Albert's name into the Canadian Expeditionary Force archives located in Ottawa. Everything is online, so you can access it quite easily. You just have to know the name of the individual, last name, what war they served in, and it helps if you have their regimental number, and you can find out, get their service file pop up right away. Now, ordinarily, you can download the entire service file, which can be fascinating for a lot of families, because you can find out every step that their relative took.
Coming up on Militaria.
So we have a perfect example of the evolution of flight safety equipment. Because again, it's a vital part of the flight safety. It's a vital equipment that they needed to operate a plane.
Peter J. Robichaud, and I brought in a First World War pilot's headgear from the Shearwater Aviation Museum's collection.
First used by the Italians in 1911, warplanes were a new and minimally explored concept before widespread adoption during the Great War. Though often glorified as fighters and bombers, most of the war's early aircraft were for reconnaissance, an enormous step up from the previously cumbersome hot air balloons. Serving in the sky came with a sense of exclusivity, and volunteers were plenty. In 1915, the emergence of air-to-air combat completely disrupted strategies on both sides, creating an arms race for air superiority. The technical and tactical advancements made in aerial warfare between 1914 and 1918 brought a deadly effectiveness to fighting. Warplanes became a vital piece of equipment in all theatres of conflict in wars to follow.
Well, I'd like to welcome Peter J. Robichaud back. He brought some items from the Shearwater Aviation Museum. This is one particular item from the Shearwater Aviation Museum's collection we have in front of us today.
Okay, here we have an item from the early days of Canadian military aviation. It's a simple leather cloth lined flying helmet.
and it's over 100 years old. Pretty good state of preservation, obviously, and there's, of course, the buckles are still there, they're intact, and we've got various pieces to it. It's a very good example of a World War I flying helmet because of its condition.
Right, it's gone through some restoration work, but it is in incredible condition. As you can see, most First World War helmets that you see of this style have a lot of splatter along the front of it due to engine fluids and other petrols, oils, and lubricants that would splash onto the pilot.
So we have a perfect example of the evolution of flight safety equipment. Because again, it's a vital part of the flight safety. It's a vital equipment that they needed to operate a plane in this environment. Obviously, the background to World War I and early aviation is open cockpits. It's wood, it's fabric covered. It's a very smaller engine in front that's fairly new technology. It's fairly unreliable, a spinning propeller. The use of one particular lubricant to lubricate the rotary engines in a lot of cases was castor oil. And castor oil is a diuretic. And if you cover yourself with castor oil, it's going to help you fly, but it's also going to affect you later once you get down out of the plane. And that was an issue, obviously, in World War I aviation. Flying helmets, you see the evolution of the coverage of the face, the use of leather. Obviously, in this time period, basically plastic wasn't there and it wasn't invented and it wasn't part of their procedure. So they had to use what materials they had. There was a lot of producing sort of flight helmets like this privately, not even military issue. So the time period of this helmet, 1914-18, we think probably later, towards the end of that period, the helmet evolution and aviation is evolving at this point too. And the missions were changing exactly what they were asking of them to do. I mean, initially in 1914, the pilots would go up and they would literally fire handguns at each other, and I think or drop bricks on enemy places. Again, by the end of that time period, we see a tremendous amount of growth and weaponry carried and bombs and machine guns and various things like that. So the helmet is part of the Shearwater Aviation Museum collection, and it's on display at the museum. You're able to see it, and it highlights obviously a part of that particular military installation's history, which stretches back to 1918. Preserving an article like this, it's hard because again, it's a leather, it's a living item.
It does require a specialist and some special care, and we do have those assets at the Shearwater Aviation Museum, and it is being cared for quite closely, and it will be back on display as soon as possible. Given the condition of this item and considering its great age, it is a testament to the hard work that the restorers actually do to maintain these items and for all of us to see.
Well, thank you for bringing this particular item in, and certainly it's another great example of part of the interesting collection at the Shearwater Aviation Museum.
You're most welcome, Mark.
The flying helmet is a great example. It's in great condition. It shows what the pilots and the observers and crewmen were wearing at that point. And what we're looking here is the genesis of the flight safety systems. And it's the original helmets, but evolved in today's equipment that we see today in modern fighter jets. So the lineage is there, and this is the original first examples of that lineage.
Coming up on Militaria.
Now this award is given out to over 71,000 Canadians, so this medal is never given singularly.
My name is Steve Brown, and I'm a semi-retired pharmaceutical buyer. I brought in the 1914-15 medal that belonged to Thomas Fleet.
Upon the conclusion of the Great War, the British Army Order 20 created the 1914-1915 Star Medal, awarded to all soldiers in the British Empire who served between August 5th, 1914 and December 31st, 1915. The bronze four-pointed star featured its recipient's number, rank, and name on its reverse. Issued alongside the British War Medal and the Victory Medal, the trio of medals was affectionately nicknamed Pip, Squeak, and Wilfred after a post-war comic strip, and comprised nearly half of the 8 awards made available to the First World War's servicemen and women. Of the 2.4 million stars distributed, 71,150 were granted to Canadians in acknowledgement for their participation and sacrifice.
I'd like to welcome Steve Brown to Militaria. I was wondering if you could show us and tell us about the artifact you brought in today.
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. The artifact I brought today was the 1914-15 star. That was given to soldiers who enlisted in the CEF between August 1914 and December 31st, 1915. And this medal belonged to Thomas Fleet.
Now, this award is given out to over 71,000 Canadians. So this medal is never given singularly. It's given out like as a mass sort of issuance at the end of the war. So now this individual is serving and wounded in the Ypres salient during the gas attack in 1950.
Correct.
Which is an enormous turning point, not only for the Allied war effort, but also for Canada. This is again a turning point, the recognition of the Canadians overseas. The Canadians hold the line at the Ypres salient, which if they hadn't, the Germans would have rolled up the line and they would have been in Paris in like 2 or 3 days. This is a critical turning point in First World War history and Canadian history in terms of nationhood and the recognition of Canadian troops. So I was wondering if you could kind of pick that up and take that to the next place that brings it to a more personal level to him down to an individual.
Thomas was born in 1884 in Liverpool, England, and he eventually immigrates to Canada, where he decides he wants to live in British Columbia. And while he's in British Columbia, he has an interesting job that I think well prepares him for what's coming. He's a lumberjack, a lumberman in BC. So being a lumberman in British Columbia in the early 1900s can't be that pleasant of an experience.
Oh, it's a hard road.
Right? So these were a lot of men in small shacks in the most, worst conditions imaginable: sleet, rain, heat, humidity, mud. And they worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day in all those conditions.
Yep.
So that's what Thomas was doing when he signed up. He signed up early in the conflict. He signed up in September 1914.
Yeah, rush to the colors.
Yes, exactly. And at the time he signed up, Thomas was 30 years old. So he was basically an old man in those terms back then. When you think about the age, right? So he had some years behind him. He spent some time in Valcartier, Quebec, training, and then he was off to England, where he did his additional training. So once that was completed, he was sent to France along with the 7th Battalion. And in April 1915, he ends up in the Ypres salient, and more importantly, he ends up in St. Julien in the Ypres salient around the 22nd of April, 1915. And it's from there that everything starts to happen. During the 22nd of April, the commanding officer for the 7th Battalion notices a bluish haze coming over the field towards the French troops that the battalion is overlooking at the time. And as the haze comes over the troops, they notice that they start retreating, first in small numbers and then in large numbers, and they're realizing that the line's breaking down. And at that point, the battalion is ordered in to shore up the lines for the retreating soldiers. So in the line goes the 7th Battalion and a few other Canadian battalions to shore up the line. And they end up holding the line on the 22nd and making sure that the Germans don't advance.
Now those troops you're mentioning, those would be the French troops from Senegal. And again, when the Germans release this gas, they have to wait for the wind to change, because the gas at that point, it's released from cylinders. And so the direction of the air is quite critical for its flow of it towards Allied trenches. So they release that gas around 4 in the afternoon. And again, they're able to prepare, and that's the other big thing too, is that once they realize that this is this new dreaded weapon that has been whispered about, the Germans had used gas on the Russian front earlier that year. And again, there'd been intelligence reports of this new weapon, but again, it wasn't very well confirmed. So again, when it's released at Ypres, Canadians have the evening of that night when it's first released to make preparations. So again, when the Germans release the gas again the next morning, the Canadian Corps, or the Canadian contingent of the 1st Division, is still in the salient, which they are enormously shocked that those Canadians are still there. Now this is, again, as you know, but people might find this ghoulish, but it was just a reality, is there was a medical officer attached to the 1st Division who had a strong understanding of gas and chemistry, and he realized that uremic acid could be used as a sort of element to save them from the gas. Field dressings, Band-Aids, etc. are taken to the latrines, or in a moment you empty your bladder or go to the latrine, soak it in urine. And this is again the earliest gas protection for the 1st Division when that attack starts the next morning. Now, what would become of Thomas after the war with his return to British Columbia?
It pretty much ends in his personal life, back to when he moves back to BC. But he does live a relatively, long life for the time. He did end up passing away in November 1948 in Vancouver, and he's buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver.
The 1914-15 Star, a benchmark sort of award given to those who had taken part in those very early stages of the war. And it's given out to some just over 71,000 Canadians. So the star does represent that very early and very fragile time period on the Western Front. Now, Steve, you were saying that this medal came into your possession, given to you by family members who had come to a talk that you had given about the First World War. How did you begin, and why do you feel this is important as a Canadian living in the 21st century to carry on these stories and sharing this Canadian history?
Well, I got interested in the First World War a while back, and I was just fascinated by the stories that I was reading. Stories like Thomas's, and there's so many of them. And the more research I did, the more obsessed I got with it. And, saying that people need to know what these men and women did during the war, the sacrifices they made. And I eventually began collecting artifacts, which I still do. 15 years later, I'm still collecting. And I would research every artifact that I have and note their stories and what happened to this person. And eventually, I started doing presentations at different historic societies, and it was at these presentations I would tell their stories, and I was surprised at the response I would get. Each one I went to, there was more and more people at each presentation.
Well, I'd like to thank you for bringing this in and sharing your scholarship and your efforts to keep the memory of this generation and their sacrifices alive in the 21st century. Thanks for bringing it in. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. My presentations, I generally do at historic societies. I get invited to go and just speak about the different artifacts that I've collected over the years. Mostly personal items that belong to soldiers. Some survived, like Thomas, and others, unfortunately, didn't make it back to Canada. And I tell their stories and make the presentation just so people understand just what, young men and women went through in the First World War.